On July 29, 2025, a 38-year-old man named Grant Gardner from Lakeville, Minnesota, sent his wife a text message from the top of a mountain in Wyoming. He told her he had made it to the summit. He told her the climb was more difficult than he had expected and that he was tired. She never heard from him again. Gardner had planned a 3-day hiking trip through the Misty Moon Lake area of Wyoming's Bighorn Mountains. He intended to summit Cloud Peak, the highest point in the range, standing at just over 13,000 feet. He was an experienced hiker. His wife Lauren later told reporters that he had been doing trips like this for almost a decade, that he knew what he was doing, that he had the skills. He left his vehicle at the West 10 Sleep Trailhead, packed proper gear, and set off alone into the backcountry. Phone records showed he reached the summit at approximately 7 in the evening. That was late. At 13,000 feet, the terrain above the tree line is a maze of cliffs, boulder fields, and ledges with no visible trails. Descending in the dark through terrain like that, with no marked path, is one of the most dangerous things a hiker can do. The sheriff's office noted this as an immediate concern. When Gardner did not return to his vehicle and stopped responding to calls and messages, his family contacted authorities. The Bighorn County Sheriff's Office initiated a search. They sent helicopters. They sent fixed-wing aircraft. They deployed ground teams and canine units. They searched for 20 days. The terrain was so severe and the altitude so punishing that 2 of the rescuers themselves had to be pulled out of the field for medical treatment. After 20 days, Sheriff Ken Blackburn made a statement. He said they had exhausted all resources and personnel. He said the most optimistic survival odds had run out. The search was suspended. Grant Gardner was found 6 days later, not by the search teams, but by a group of professional climbers from North Carolina who happened to notice a slight reflection from underneath a ledge, a few hundred feet above their camp. It was the fabric of his backpack, catching the last light of the day. His body was nearby. He had been wearing clothing that, in the sheriff's words, very closely matched the terrain he was climbing in. He was so well camouflaged against the rock that multiple aerial searches had flown directly over him and seen nothing. He was found in one of the 2 primary search areas. The sheriff's office confirmed that the location very closely matched one of the highest probability scenarios they had been working with. Grant Gardner had been exactly where the search models predicted he would be. For 20 days, with helicopters and planes and dogs and dozens of trained personnel, they could not find a man who was lying in precisely the spot their own analysis told them to look. His wife Lauren and their 2 children, aged 11 and 13, were informed shortly after the recovery. Lauren had told reporters during the search that her husband knew what he was doing, that he had the skills, that this had never happened in all the years he had gone out. She was right about all of it. He did know what he was doing. He did have the skills, and none of it mattered. Now here is what most people watching this do not know about the place where Grant Gardner died. The Cloud Peak Wilderness is not just a section of the Bighorn National Forest. It is a federally designated wilderness area, capital W. That designation comes from a law signed in 1964 by President Lyndon Johnson. And that law says something very specific about what can and cannot happen inside these boundaries. No permanent roads, no motor vehicles, no helicopters without special authorization, no motorized equipment of any kind, no landing of aircraft, no permanent structures or installations. Every tool, every machine, every engine that a search and rescue team wants to use inside a designated wilderness area must be justified through a federal process called the Minimum Requirements Analysis. The search teams looking for Grant Gardner were not just fighting 13,000 feet of elevation and boulder fields with no trails. They were operating inside a legal framework that was designed, by statute, to keep human tools out of wild places. The Cloud Peak Wilderness is 191,000 acres. That makes it one of the smaller designated wilderness areas in the country. Across 44 states, there are over 800 of these zones covering 111 million acres of American land. That is an area larger than the entire state of California. And inside every one of them, the same restrictions apply. But there is another layer to this story, one that does not appear in any federal statute or any government report. The indigenous peoples whose traditional territories overlap with these wilderness areas, the Shoshone, the Nez Perce, the Blackfeet, the Ojibwe, the Yakima, and dozens of other nations, have been in these mountains for thousands of years, long before any law was written, long before any trail was marked, long before any map was drawn. They walked this land, and they mapped it in ways the federal government never did. Their maps contain something ours do not: warnings, specific places where you do not make camp, specific valleys where you do not travel alone, specific elevations where, if the forest goes silent, you turn around and leave. They did not just know where the water was and where the elk gathered. They knew where people disappeared. They knew which places were safe and which were not. And they tried to tell us. In 1964, the United States government drew lines on a map and called these places wilderness. They sealed them off with a law that makes them nearly impossible to search when someone goes missing. They locked the door. The people who lived there for 10,000 years already knew what was inside. My name is Alex, and what I am about to walk you through is the story of 111 million acres of America that are, by federal law, almost impossible to search. A law that was written to protect the land from human development. But the people who knew this land longest and best, the ones who walked it for hundreds of generations before any European set foot on this continent, they say the land does not need protecting. They say we are the ones who need protecting from what lives inside it. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe and let us know where you are watching from in the comments. Thanks. To understand how 111 million acres of America became, for practical purposes, unsearchable, you need to go back to the years after World War II. The 1950s were a period of extraordinary expansion across the American landscape. Highways were cutting through forests that had been untouched for centuries. Dams were flooding valleys that indigenous peoples had lived in for millennia. Mining operations were chewing into mountainsides that had never seen a drill or a blast charge. The federal government was building at a pace and scale that the continent had never experienced, and the land that was being consumed was not coming back. In 1950, the Bureau of Reclamation proposed building a dam inside Dinosaur National Monument on the Utah-Colorado border. The dam would have flooded Echo Park, one of the most dramatic canyon landscapes in the American West. Conservationists fought it and eventually won. But the battle exposed a fundamental problem. Even lands that were supposed to be protected, national parks, national forests, primitive areas, could be developed if the political will existed. There was no legal mechanism to permanently prevent it. A man named Howard Zahnazer, the executive secretary of the Wilderness Society, decided to write one. He drafted the first version of what would become the Wilderness Act. Over the next 8 years, that draft went through 66 revisions. It was rewritten, gutted, rebuilt, debated in committee, killed, revived, and fought over by every interest group that had a stake in federal land. Zahnazer testified before Congress on behalf of the bill 18 times. He dedicated the last decade of his life to getting it passed. He died on May 5th, 1964, 4 months before the bill became law. He never saw it signed. On September 3, 1964, President Lyndon Johnson signed the Wilderness Act. It passed the Senate 73-12 and the House of Representatives 373-1, near unanimous. Whatever this law was doing, almost nobody in the United States government opposed it. What the law did was create a new category of federal land protection, the highest level of protection that exists in American law. The Wilderness Act established the National Wilderness Preservation System and defined wilderness as, and I am reading directly from the statute, an area where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man, where man himself is a visitor who does not remain. A visitor who does not remain. Remember that phrase. We will come back to it. The law designated 54 areas across 13 states, totaling 9.1 million acres. Inside these boundaries, the Act prohibited all permanent roads, all motor vehicles, all motorized equipment, all aircraft landings, all commercial enterprise, and all permanent structures or installations. The only exception written into the statute was for measures required in emergencies involving the health and safety of persons within the area. And even that exception was qualified by the phrase "the minimum requirements" for the administration of the area. In practice, this means that even in a life or death search and rescue operation, the people running it are required to consider the impact on the wilderness character of the land alongside the survival of the missing person. The Wilderness Connect guidelines, maintained by an interagency partnership of the 4 federal agencies that manage wilderness, state explicitly that search and rescue plans should be developed in advance using the minimum requirements framework so that all parties involved are following established procedures during the emergency. Translation: before someone goes missing, the agencies are supposed to have already decided how much machinery they are allowed to bring in to find them. If they have not done that paperwork, the emergency itself is not supposed to be the moment where those decisions get made. The guidelines say it is too late to prepare a detailed analysis once someone is already lost, but they also say the minimum requirements concept should still be applied. The practical consequence of all of this is straightforward. Inside designated wilderness, there are no maintained roads to most trailheads, no cell towers, no GPS infrastructure, no permanent search and rescue stations, no helicopter landing pads. When someone vanishes, search teams go in on foot, carrying what they can, into terrain that has been deliberately kept in its most primitive state. And the clock starts running from the moment that person stops answering their phone. I want to be clear about something here because I think it matters for how you hear the rest of this video. I do not think the people who wrote this law were trying to make it harder to find missing hikers. I genuinely believe they were trying to save beautiful places from being destroyed by development. Howard Zanusser spent the last decade of his life fighting for this, and he died before he could see it happen. The Wilderness Act is, in many ways, one of the most idealistic pieces of legislation ever passed by the United States Congress. It says that some places should be left alone, that some landscapes are worth more undeveloped than developed, that future generations deserve to see what this country looked like before we paved it over. I agree with all of that, and I also think the 111 million acres of land where you cannot conduct a proper search for a missing human being is a number that should make every hiker in America sit down and think for a minute before they lace up their boots. The Wilderness Act started with 54 areas and 9.1 million acres. That number has grown almost every year since 1964. The largest single expansion came in 1980, when the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act added over 56 million acres in one stroke. By 2023, the system included 806 designated wilderness areas across 44 states and Puerto Rico, covering 111,889,002 acres, an area larger than the state of California. Some of these places are small, a few thousand acres of protected wetland or coastal habitat. Others are immense, and none of them are more immense or more aptly named than the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness in central Idaho. I want you to understand the scale of what happened between 1964 and today. In 60 years, the National Wilderness Preservation System grew from 54 areas to 806, from 9.1 million acres to 111 million, from 13 states to 44. Every year, or nearly every year, Congress or a president added more land. The largest single expansion came in 1980 with the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act, which added 56 million acres in one stroke. But even outside of Alaska, the system has grown steadily. New wilderness areas have been designated in nearly every decade since the original law was signed. The Omnibus Public Land Management Act of 2009 added 2 million acres across 9 states. The John D. Dingell Jr. Conservation Act of 2019 added another 1.3 million. The system does not shrink, it only grows, and with every acre added, the same restrictions apply. 2.4 million acres, the largest contiguous wilderness area in the lower 48 states, bigger than Yellowstone and Yosemite combined. The Salmon River runs through it, carving a canyon that is, in places, deeper than the Grand Canyon. The river earned its name in the early days of Western expansion, when travelers built massive wooden sweep boats to float downstream. The current was so powerful that once you launched, there was no way to return upstream. The boats were disassembled at the destination, and the wood reused for lumber. You went in. You did not come back the way you entered. The River of No Return. Think about that name for a moment. This is not a nickname that tourists gave it. This is not marketing. This is a name that came from direct experience, from people who built boats out of raw timber and launched them into a canyon so deep and so violent that the very idea of coming back the way you came was physically impossible. The river made the decision for you. Once you were in, you were in. The terrain surrounding the river is equally unforgiving. The Salmon River Mountains, the Clearwater Mountains, the Bighorn Crags, steep canyons dropping thousands of feet into river gorges, dense coniferous forests at elevation, alpine lakes sitting in basins so remote that some of them do not appear on any commercially available map. The wilderness is managed cooperatively by 4 national forests, the Salmon Shala, the Payette, the Nez Perce Clearwater, and the Bitterroot, plus a small section administered by the Bureau of Land Management. Just coordinating a search across those administrative boundaries adds layers of bureaucratic complexity before a single boot hits the ground. The wilderness contains 2,616 miles of maintained trails across 296 trail systems. That sounds like a lot until you consider the next number. 1.5 million of the 2.4 million acres have no trails at all. More than half of the wilderness is trail-free. If someone steps off the path, they are walking into country where no maintained route exists, no sign points the way home, and no one is coming by vehicle to find them. To access the wilderness by air, there are 26 primitive airstrips that predate the wilderness designation, grandfathered in as existing uses. These are dirt strips carved into valley floors, some of them barely 2,000 feet long, wedged between canyon walls. Jet boats are also permitted on the main fork of the Salmon, another grandfathered use. But beyond these narrow corridors of motorized access, The 2.4 million acres are governed by the same restrictions as every other designated wilderness in the system. No roads, no vehicles, no helicopters without authorization, no infrastructure. When someone goes missing in the Frank Church, the nearest paved road might be 40 miles away through terrain that gains or loses thousands of feet of elevation. A search team on foot carrying their own supplies might take 2 or 3 days just to reach the area where the missing person was last seen. By then, if the person is injured, if the person has fallen into a canyon, if the person has encountered something they did not expect, the survival window may already be closing. The Shoshone-Bannock and Nez Perce peoples have used this land for at least 12,000 years. Their presence is documented by archaeological sites scattered throughout the wilderness, lithic scatters, village sites, pictographs painted on canyon walls, and bighorn sheep hunting traps built into the ridgelines. Both nations continue to hunt, fish, and gather within the wilderness boundaries today. Their oral histories predate any written record of this landscape by thousands of years, and their oral histories are specific. Not every valley is the same. Not every canyon is safe. Not every trail that leads into the mountains leads back out. The Shoshone-Bannock and Nez Perce did not avoid these mountains. They lived in them, but they knew which parts of the landscape demanded respect and which demanded distance. That knowledge was accumulated over hundreds of generations of direct, unbroken experience. When the United States Congress drew lines on a map in 1980 and called this place the River of No Return Wilderness, they were not naming something new. They were naming something that the Shoshone-Bannock had known for 12,000 years. The difference is that Congress sealed the land with a federal statute. The Shoshone-Bannock sealed certain places within it with something older and possibly more accurate. Accumulated knowledge of what happens to people who go where they should not go. The Nez Perce, who share stewardship of this land, have their own traditions. Their stories about the Salmon River country do not treat the mountains as empty. They treat them as inhabited, not by people, not by animals, by something that was here before either, something that the Nez Perce learned to coexist with by understanding where it lived and by staying out of those places. When the federal government designated the wilderness, it did not consult those traditions. It did not ask the Nez Perce which valleys were safe and which were not. It simply drew a boundary, applied a uniform set of restrictions, and called it preservation. Grant Gardner in the Cloud Peak Wilderness is not an isolated case. It is a single data point in a pattern that stretches across 44 states and 6 decades of federal wilderness designation. Every year, approximately 600,000 people go missing in the United States. The vast majority are found quickly, within hours or days, but a subset, tens of thousands, remain missing for more than a year. And within that subset, a further concentration disappears in wilderness areas, in national parks, in national forests, and in the federally designated wilderness zones where the search restrictions are most severe. Here is something that should concern you. There is no comprehensive federal database of people who have gone missing in designated wilderness areas. The National Park Service tracks missing persons in national parks. The Forest Service tracks incidents on national forest land. The Bureau of Land Management handles its own records. The Fish and Wildlife Service handles its own. But no single agency maintains a unified record of disappearances across all 806 designated wilderness areas. The data is fragmented across 4 federal agencies, across dozens of regional offices, across hundreds of county sheriff departments that have jurisdiction over the land but no centralized reporting system. Independent researchers have tried to compile the numbers. Organizations like Locations Unknown have built databases by pulling case files from sheriff offices, cross-referencing NUMUS entries, and filing Freedom of Information requests. What they have found is geographic clustering. The disappearances are not evenly distributed across the system. They concentrate in specific wilderness areas, in specific drainages, in specific elevation bands. The same corridors produce missing persons reports decade after decade. The same trailheads appear in case files separated by years or decades. The Bob Marshall Wilderness in Montana is one of these places. 1.5 million acres when combined with the adjacent Great Bear and Scapegoat wilderness areas. Known locally as the Bob, it is one of the most remote areas in the contiguous United States. The Continental Divide runs through it. Grizzly bear density is among the highest in the lower 48. The terrain is a labyrinth of mountain ridges and river valleys separated by passes that can be snowed in for 8 months of the year. There are peaks above 9,000 feet and valley floors below 4,000. Between them, dense forests of lodgepole pine and Douglas fir, where visibility drops to a few dozen feet in every direction. The Blackfeet, Salish, and Kootenai nations all have traditional territories overlapping with the Bob. Their oral traditions contain specific prohibitions about certain valleys and passes within the wilderness. Places where you do not travel at certain times of year. Places where the animals behave differently. Where the elk avoid ridgelines they normally favor. Where the birds go silent in patterns that do not correspond to weather or season. Places where the old stories say something other than bears is responsible for the people who do not come back. The wilderness was named after Bob Marshall, a forester and explorer who walked thousands of miles through this country in the 1930s, sometimes covering 30 or 40 miles in a single day across terrain that would break most modern hikers. Marshall was one of the founders of the Wilderness Society. He died in 1939 at the age of 38, and the wilderness was designated in his honor. He spent years in these mountains, alone, covering ground that no one else wanted to cover. The Blackfeet elders he met during his travels told him things about the deep interior that he recorded in his journals, but never published. Those journals are now in the archives of the University of Montana. Then there are the Boundary Waters in Minnesota. Over 1 million acres of lakes, rivers, islands, and boreal forest along the Canadian border. It is the most visited wilderness area in the entire National Wilderness Preservation System, drawing more than 150,000 visitors per year. Unlike the mountain wildernesses of the West, the Boundary Waters is a water wilderness, a maze of over 1,000 lakes connected by rivers and portage trails, many of them barely marked, winding through forests of birch, spruce, and pine that look identical in every direction. The Ojibwe have inhabited this region for centuries, and their oral traditions contain specific warnings about certain lake systems and portage routes. Some of these warnings are practical: strong currents, submerged rocks, areas where sudden storms blow in across open water with no warning. But others are different. Certain lakes carry names in Ojibwe Mowin that translate to concepts most modern canoeists would not expect to encounter on a fishing trip. The warnings are not about weather or terrain. They are about something in the water, something in the islands, something that the Ojibwe say has always lived in the deepest parts of the lake country, and that does not appreciate visitors. Despite the high visitation numbers, people vanish in the Boundary Waters regularly. The maze of waterways, islands, and dense forest makes search operations extraordinarily difficult, even before the wilderness restrictions add another layer of complication. A canoeist who capsizes and swims to the wrong island can be less than a mile from their intended route and completely invisible to searchers. The water is dark, stained tea-brown by tannic acid from decomposing vegetation. When something goes into the water in the boundary waters, it tends to stay there. The terrain is different in each of these places. Wyoming's Bighorn Mountains are not Montana's Bob Marshall. Montana's Bob Marshall is not Minnesota's boundary waters. Idaho's River of No Return is not like any of them. Different elevation, different climate, different vegetation, different wildlife. But the legal framework is identical. The same law applies in all 806 areas. No roads, no vehicles, no motorized equipment without authorization, no permanent search infrastructure. When someone disappears, the response is governed by the same statute, the same restrictions, the same bureaucratic process, whether it happens at 13,000 feet on a Wyoming summit or on a portage trail in the Minnesota Lake Country. And in every one of these places, the indigenous peoples who lived there first have oral traditions about parts of the landscape that are not safe. Not because of weather, not because of terrain, not because of wildlife, because of something else, something that the federal government did not account for when it drew the lines and wrote the law. I've been making videos about wilderness disappearances for a while now, and the pattern that keeps emerging is the same one, over and over. A location that indigenous peoples marked as dangerous, centuries or millennia before any European arrived. An institution, the government, the military, a mining company, that either ignores those warnings or seals the area off without acknowledging them. And then people start disappearing, and nobody connects the dots because the data is scattered across a dozen different filing cabinets in a dozen different county offices that have never talked to each other. The Wilderness Act takes that pattern and scales it to 111 million acres. Let me say something directly, because I think it matters. I am not saying the Wilderness Act is a bad law. I am not saying we should build roads through the Frank Church or fly helicopters over the boundary waters for no reason. The people who wrote this law, Howard Zanusser in particular, dedicated their lives to protecting landscapes that were being destroyed by industrial development. The Act has preserved some of the last truly wild places in the United States. That is not nothing. That matters. But there is a structural consequence of this law that nobody talks about, and I think it needs to be said out loud. The more land we designate as wilderness, the more land falls under restrictions that make it harder to find people who go missing inside it. The system started at 9.1 million acres. It is now over 111 million. It grows almost every year. Congress adds new areas. Presidents recommend designations. Conservation groups lobby for expansion. And every acre that gets added is another acre where roads cannot be built, where helicopters face restrictions, where search teams cannot bring motorized equipment without navigating a federal process. That is not a conspiracy. It is arithmetic. More restricted land equals more territory where disappearances are harder to investigate. The growth of the system is driven by conservation goals, and those goals are legitimate. But the consequence of that growth is an expanding territory where the tools we use to find missing people are legally constrained. You can believe the Wilderness Act is good law and still acknowledge that 111 million unsearchable acres is a number that should make you pause. And then there is the record keeping. No unified database, 4 managing agencies, 806 wilderness areas across 44 states. When a person goes missing in a designated wilderness, the incident is logged by whichever agency manages that specific parcel of land. If the wilderness spans multiple national forests, as the Frank Church spans 6, the record might be split across multiple administrative units. If the search is led by a county sheriff, which it often is, the case file lives in a county office that may have a staff of 5 people. Compare that to aviation. When a plane goes missing, a centralized federal investigation is triggered automatically. When a worker dies on a job site, OSHA records it in a national database. But when a person walks into the largest contiguous wilderness in the lower 48 and never comes out, the case file sits in a filing cabinet in a rural Idaho county office. There is no national aggregation. There is no pattern analysis. There is no single place where you can look up how many people have disappeared inside America's 111 million acres of designated wilderness and compare the numbers across regions, across decades, across terrain types. Think about what that means in practice. If 3 people disappeared in the same drainage of the Frank Church Wilderness in 2005, 2012, and 2019, each case would be handled by a different search team, possibly a different county, possibly a different managing forest, and filed in a different cabinet. Nobody would ever put those 3 cases next to each other and notice that they happened in the same canyon. Nobody would ask why that canyon keeps producing missing persons reports. Nobody would check whether the Nez Perce or the Shoshone Bannock have a name for that canyon, and whether that name translates to a warning. If you wanted to design a system that makes it difficult to find missing people and difficult to notice when the missing persons numbers start clustering in specific locations, you could not do much better than what we have now. I do not think that was the intention, but it is the result. Now I want to talk about the part that keeps me up at night. Every Indigenous nation whose traditional territory overlaps with designated wilderness, every single one of them, has oral traditions about what lives in the deep interior. Not all of these traditions are public. Not all of them are meant to be shared outside the community. I respect that, and I am not going to pretend I have access to knowledge that was not given to me. But the traditions that are public, the ones that have been documented by anthropologists, recorded in published interviews, or shared by tribal members in their own words, those traditions share common features that are hard to ignore. There are places where the animals go silent. There are corridors where experienced hunters, people who have spent their entire lives in the mountains, refuse to travel alone. There are cave systems and canyon bottoms and old-growth groves that carry names in Indigenous languages that translate to warnings. Stay away. Do not camp here. Do not go alone. Do not go at night. If the birds stop singing, leave. The Yakima of Washington state have a tradition called the Steyehama, the stick people, entities described as spirits hiding under the cover of the woods in the Cascade Mountains. The Yakima word literally translates to a spirit hiding under the cover of the woods. This is not ancient mythology pulled from a dusty library book. This tradition was documented firsthand by a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service biologist during a 1997 visit to sacred Yakama forest land on the eastern slopes of the Cascades. The biologist was told that certain hills in the range are designated as sacred stick people territory that should not be entered. If they are visited, the stick people will do you harm. The tradition also describes these beings poking sticks into lodges to extract or harass victims, or raining sticks down upon them from above. The tradition persists to this day. The Yakama do not treat this as folklore. They treat it as practical information about the landscape they live in. The Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, which covers 1.3 million acres along the western slopes of those same Cascade Mountains, is where 19-year-old Maureen Kelly vanished in June of 2013. She left a campground near Mount St. Helens on what she called a spiritual quest, walked into the forest, and was never seen again. Search teams found footprints leading to a road. The footprints stopped. The trail vanished on the pavement as if she had simply ceased to exist at that point. Helicopters could not fly because of cloud cover. The official search was suspended after 2 days. Her body has never been found. The undersheriff said a searcher could literally walk right on top of somebody in that terrain and never know it. That was in 2013. More than a decade later, Maureen Kelly is still missing somewhere inside the Cascades, in country the Yakama have been warning people about for centuries. The Shoshone-Bannock have stories about the deep interior of what is now the Frank Church Wilderness. The Nez Perce have their own. The Blackfeet have traditions about certain passes in the Bob Marshall that you do not cross at certain times of year. The Ojibwe have names for places in the boundary waters that carry meanings no trail guide will translate for you. These warnings predate the Wilderness Act by thousands of years. They predate the United States by thousands of years. They predate the English language by thousands of years. The indigenous peoples were not protecting the land from people. They were protecting people from the land, or more precisely, from whatever lives on it that they had learned over hundreds of generations to respect and avoid. The Wilderness Act did the opposite. It protected the land from us. It made 111 million acres legally difficult to access with the tools we use to investigate, to search, to recover, to understand what happened. Whatever lives in those places, whatever the Shoshone-Bannock and the Nez Perce and the Blackfeet and the Ojibwe and the Yakama have been warning about for millennia, now has the full practical protection of federal law, not because the law was designed to protect it, but because the law was designed to protect the land, and the land is where it lives. Nobody in Congress in 1964 was thinking about that. Howard Zahniser was not thinking about that. President Johnson was not thinking about that when he signed the bill. They were thinking about dams and highways and mining operations and the disappearing American frontier. They were trying to save beautiful places from bulldozers. But the consequence of what they built is a system where 111 million acres of American landscape are governed by rules that make it extraordinarily difficult to search for missing people, extraordinarily difficult to aggregate data about where those people are disappearing, and extraordinarily difficult to investigate what is happening to them after they vanish. And the people who knew this land best, the people who had been walking it for 12,000 years before any law was written, they had already figured out what the government has not. Some of these places are not safe, not because of the weather, not because of the terrain, not because of the bears, because of something else, something that does not appear in any federal statute, any environmental impact assessment, or any search and rescue after action report. I want to come back to that phrase from the Wilderness Act, the one I asked you to remember. A wilderness is an area where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man, where man himself is a visitor who does not remain. A visitor who does not remain. Howard Zahniser wrote that line to describe a philosophy of conservation, the idea that we should pass through these places gently, leave no trace, and let the land exist in its natural state. It is a beautiful idea. It is the kind of sentence that gets carved into stone at the entrance to national parks. But for the families of the people on those missing persons lists, the people who walked into these 111 million acres and never walked out, that phrase means something different. They were visitors. They did not remain. And nobody can go in with the full weight of modern technology and find out why. Grant Gardner texted his wife from the summit. He said he was tired. He was found a month later underneath a ledge, wearing clothing that matched the rock so closely that helicopter crews flew over him for weeks and never saw him. The sheriff said it was a tragic accident. Maybe it was. But he was found in one of the primary search areas, in one of the highest probability locations, and 20 days of searching with every available resource could not locate him. It took a random group of climbers and a lucky reflection of light off a backpack strap to find a man who had been exactly where everyone expected him to be. Today, there are 806 of these designated wilderness areas, 111 million acres. The system grows almost every year. More land, more restrictions, more places where the trails end and the maintained paths fade into unmarked forest and canyon and mountain and cave systems that no road reaches and no helicopter routinely surveys. Every summer, tens of thousands of people walk into these places with their new gear and their trip plans and their confidence that they understand what they are walking into. Some of them file plans with the Forest Service. Some of them tell 3 people where they are going. Some of them carry satellite communicators. They do everything right. And some of them do not come back. I think about Grant Gardner's last text message, sent from 13,000 feet. I made it to the summit. The climb was more taxing than expected. I am tired. Those were the last words his wife ever received from him. He was standing on top of a mountain, looking out at miles of country in every direction, and he did not know that within hours he would be underneath a ledge that search teams would fly over for weeks without ever seeing him. He did not know that the clothing he chose for warmth and practicality would make him invisible against the rock. He did not know that the wilderness that surrounded him was governed by a law that would constrain every effort to bring him home. He was a visitor who did not remain. The Wilderness Act says man is a visitor who does not remain. The Shoshone Bannock and the Nez Perce would tell you that is true, but not for the reason Howard Zanisser intended. They would tell you that some of these places have always taken visitors, long before any law was written, long before any map was drawn, long before any president signed any piece of paper. They would tell you the law did not create the danger. The danger was already there. The law just made it harder for anyone to do anything about it. If you are planning a hike into designated wilderness this summer, I am not going to tell you not to go. I am going to tell you to pay attention, file a plan, carry a communicator, stay on maintained trails, tell someone exactly where you are going and exactly when you expect to be back. And if the forest goes quiet, if the birds stop singing and the insects go silent and the air goes still in a way that does not feel like calm, then trust the instinct that tells you something is wrong. Because the people who walked this land for 12,000 years before you, the people who knew every ridge and every valley and every cave, they trusted that instinct too, and they survived. I think about something an elder once told a researcher in the Frank Church country about why certain places in those mountains carry the warnings they do. He did not say the places were evil. He did not say they were cursed. He said they were old, older than people, older than the stories, and the things that lived in those old places were not good or bad. They were simply hungry and patient, and they had been there long before any human being set foot in those mountains. They are still there. We drew lines on a map. We wrote a law. We called it wilderness, and we locked the door. But the people who lived there first, the people who are still there, they will tell you the door was never keeping us out. It was keeping something in.